In the unforgiving dust of the American West, a story isn't just told, it's etched in grit and survival. What if the most valuable thing at a town auction wasn't cattle or land, but a man in chains? And what if the only person willing to bid was a pregnant widow, with nothing left to her name but a failing farm and a fierce will to live? She bought a shackled mountain man and his silent son, an act of foolish charity in the eyes of all who watched. But they didn't see the secret he carried in his memory or the storm of vengeance that followed him. They thought they were watching a woman buy her own ruin. They had no idea they were witnessing the first spark of a fire that would burn their town's darkest secret to the ground. The sun was a merciless hammer over the town of Redemption's Bluff, beating the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder. For Abigail Thorne, the heat was a physical manifestation of her grief, a constant, suffocating weight. 6 months, a widow, 7 months with child, she felt the stares of the townsfolk like brands on her skin. They saw a woman teetering on the edge of ruin, her late husband Thomas's small ranch, slowly succumbing to drought and neglect. They whispered their pity from behind cupped hands, their compassion as thin and brittle as sun-baked prairie grass. Today, however, the town's attention was fixed on the auction platform, hastily erected outside the sheriff's office. It wasn't livestock or foreclosed property being sold. It was human desperation. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest, presided over the proceedings with a smug air of authority. On the platform stood a man and a young boy. The man was a giant, built of the rock and pine of the mountains he was clearly from. His hair was a wild, dark mane, his beard tangled and unkempt. Heavy iron shackles bound his wrists and ankles, the chains clinking with a grim finality every time he shifted his weight. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing, sweeping over the crowd with a look of cold, contained fury. Beside him, clutching his leg, was a boy of perhaps 7 or 8 years. He was a miniature version of the man, all sharp angles and wide, terrified eyes. He didn't cry or make a sound, his silence more heartbreaking than any wail. "What we have here," Sheriff Brody boomed, his voice slick with false piety, "is a vagrant and accused horse thief, Jasper Kane, captured up in the Blackstone Range. The territory wants him for trial, but transport costs money. So the Honorable Judge Morrison has decreed his indenture, and that of his boy Finn, be sold to the highest bidder for a term of 5 years. A strong back for your farm, a boy for chores, all to cover the cost of justice." A murmur went through the crowd. Indenture was a hair's breadth from slavery, a legal loophole for the desperate and the despised. Men sized up Jasper's powerful shoulders, calculating his worth in cords of wood, chopped and fields ploughed. Women clucked their tongues, seeing only a dangerous savage and his whelp. "Look at the state of him." One woman, Martha Gable, sniffed to her friend. "A wild animal. Who would bring that near their home?" Abigail stood at the back of the crowd, her hand resting protectively on the swell of her belly. She had come to town for flour and salt, not to witness this grim spectacle. Yet she found herself unable to look away. She saw past the grime and the chains. She saw the way the man Jasper subtly shifted his body to shield the boy from the worst of the sun, the way his jaw tightened when a man in the front row made a cruel joke about the boy's silence. In his eyes, beneath the fury, she saw a desperate, caged protectiveness that resonated deep within her own soul. She too was fighting to protect a child against a world that seemed determined to crush them. "Do I hear $20? The auctioneer called out. $20 for 5 years of hard labor. Bartholomew Higgins, the wealthiest cattle baron in the county, let out a dismissive laugh. I wouldn't pay 20 cents for that trash, Brody. He'd likely murder you in your sleep. Higgins was a man who owned most of the valley and acted as if he owned its people too. He stood with his hands on his hips, a gold watch chain gleaming against his expensive waistcoat, his gaze lingering on Jasper with an intensity that seemed more personal than simple disdain. The bidding was sluggish. $10 was offered, then $15. The price stalled the crowd's interest, waning in the oppressive heat. They were here for the show, not the purchase. Abigail felt a strange, impulsive thought take root in her mind. It was madness. Thomas had left her with a mortgage and just enough savings to see her through the birth if she was frugal. Buying a man a dangerous accused criminal was the act of a lunatic. And yet, she looked at the boy Finn, whose small face was a mask of stoic terror. He hadn't let go of his father's leg once. She thought of the child beneath her heart, and a wave of fierce, unthinking empathy washed over her. What if that were her child alone and terrified? $17 all a farmer near the front called. 20 another countered. Sheriff Brody looked impatient. $20 going once. The auctioneer scanned the crowd, his eyes passing over Abigail without a second glance. In that moment, something inside her snapped. The whispers, the pitying looks, the suffocating loneliness of the past 6 months, it all coalesced into a single defiant act. $50, Abigail said. Her voice, though not loud, cut through the midday hum like a blade. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads swiveled in her direction, eyes wide with disbelief. Sheriff Brody squinted, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Higgins turned fully, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. Well, well. Higgins drawled his voice, carrying easily. The grieving widow has a charitable streak, or perhaps she's just lonely. A few cruel chuckles followed his remark. Abigail's face burned with humiliation, but she lifted her chin, her gaze locking with the man on the platform. For the first time, Jasper Kane looked directly at her. The fury in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of stunned confusion. The auctioneer, recovering from his shock, grinned. $50 from Mrs. Thorne. Do I hear 60? The town was silent. No one would bid against the mad widow. It was her folly and hers alone. Going once, going twice. Sheriff Brody slammed the gavel down on a wooden crate. Sold to Mrs. Abigail Thorne for $50. The transaction was a blur of paperwork and the clinking of coins, nearly every last dollar she had in the world. As Sheriff Brody handed her the indenture papers, his sweaty palm brushed against hers. You've made a terrible mistake, Mom, he whispered, his breath smelling of stale coffee. That man is trouble. You mark my words. Abigail ignored him. She walked toward the platform, the legal documents clutched in her hand. The crowd parted for her, their whispers following her like hornets. She stopped before the shackled man and the boy. Up close, Jasper was even more imposing. Scars, old and new, crisscrossed his arms and face. He smelled of sweat dirt and pine needles. He stared down at her, his expression unreadable, a wall of stone. I am Abigail Thorne, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. You and your son will come with me. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply watched her, his stormy eyes searching her face for what a trick, malice, weakness. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He placed a heavy hand on Finn's shoulder, a silent reassurance. The journey back to the Thorne Ranch had just begun, and Abigail knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she hadn't just bought a laborer. She had bought a secret, and it was a secret that might just cost her everything. The 2-mile walk from Redemption's Bluff to the Thorne Ranch was a silent, suffocating ordeal. Abigail led the way, her old mare Daisy pulling a small wagon with the few supplies she'd managed to afford. Behind her, Jasper and Finn followed on foot. The rhythmic clink and scrape of Jasper's chains was a constant grim reminder of the transaction that had just taken place. Every citizen they passed on the edge of town stopped to stare their faces, a mixture of morbid curiosity and outright condemnation. Abigail kept her eyes fixed on the dusty road ahead, her back straight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her doubt. When they finally arrived, the sight of the ranch did little to inspire confidence. The small clapboard house was in desperate need of a coat of paint. The porch steps sagged, and the barn door hung crookedly on a single hinge. The fields which Thomas had once tended with such pride were parched and brown, the cornstalks brittle skeletons rattling in the hot breeze. It was a portrait of decay, a testament to a life cut short, and a dream withering on the vine. Abigail led them to the small, sturdy shed that Thomas had used as a workshop. It was clean and dry, a far cry from the town jail. "You and your son will stay here," she said, her voice betraying none of the fear fluttering in her chest. She was alone on this isolated property, with a man accused of being a violent criminal. Jasper surveyed the shed, then his eyes landed on the shackles that bound him. "And these," his voice was a low rumble rough from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken to her. Abigail's heart pounded. This was the moment of truth. She could keep him chained, treat him as the prisoner the town believed him to be, and live in constant fear. Or she could take a leap of faith so vast it defied all reason. She thought of Finn's silent, watchful eyes. No child should see his father in chains. She took a deep breath. "There's a well out back. Get yourselves cleaned up. I'll bring you food. Then," she paused, meeting his gaze, "we will talk about the chains." She left them, her hands trembling, as she drew water and prepared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat. It was more than she could comfortably spare, but she couldn't bring herself to offer them scraps. When she returned, she found them by the well. Jasper had worked the pump, and now, with his back to her, he was gently washing the grime from his son's face and hair with a piece of rag. The tenderness of the gesture was so at odds with his savage appearance that it made Abigail's breath catch in her throat. After they had eaten in a tense, watchful silence, Abigail gestured for Jasper to sit on an old tree stump. Finn immediately scrambled into his father's lap, a silent sentinel. "I am not a slave owner, Mr. Kane." Abigail began, forcing her voice to remain even. "I am a woman in need of help. This ranch is all I have, and as you can see, I am losing it. My husband died in the spring." Jasper watched her, his expression unreadable. "I will offer you a deal." She continued the words, feeling reckless as they left her lips. "The indenture papers say you belong to me for 5 years, but I will tear them up on one condition. You will give me your word that you will work this land with me, help me bring it back, at least until my child is born, and I am on my feet. You will give me your word that you will not harm me or my property, and that you will not run." His stormy eyes narrowed. "And in return, she said, her voice dropping, "I will treat you as a man, not property. I will provide food and shelter for you and your son. And right now," she held up a large, rusty key she'd found in Thomas's workshop, "I will take off those chains." It was an insane gamble. He was powerful enough to overpower her in an instant. Once free, he could vanish into the hills, and she would be left a fool $50 poorer and the laughingstock of the entire county. He stared at the key, then back at her face. He seemed to be looking right through her, weighing her, judging her. A long, agonizing minute passed. Finn squirmed, burying his face in his father's chest. Finally, Jasper spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I am not a horse thief." The sheriff said. "The sheriff lies." He cut her off, his tone flat and absolute. but I have no way to prove it. Not yet. He looked down at his son, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. We will not run. You have my word. Her hand shook as she knelt before him. The iron of the shackles was cold and heavy. The lock was old and stiff, and it took all her strength to turn the key. The first manacle sprang open with a loud click. Jasper didn't move. She moved to the other wrist, then the ankles. With each lock that opened, she felt a strange lightening, as if she were freeing herself as well. When the last chain fell away with a thud into the dust, Jasper slowly stood up. He flexed his wrists, rubbing the raw, chafed skin. He was taller than she'd realized, a true mountain of a man, and for a terrifying moment, Abigail thought she had made the worst mistake of her life. He could break her in two, but he didn't. He looked from his own freed hands, to her a complex emotion swirling in his eyes. Not gratitude, not yet, but a deep, grudging respect. The roof on that barn needs patching before the next rain, he said, his voice practical. And the fence by the creek is down. Your cattle will wander. And just like that, the bargain was sealed, not by a handshake, but by the shared understanding of work that needed to be done. Over the next few days, a new tentative rhythm established itself on the Thorn Ranch. Jasper was a tireless worker. He rose before the sun and worked long after it had set. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life of hard labor and self-sufficiency. He mended the barn roof, reset the fence posts, and began the back-breaking work of clearing the irrigation ditches Thomas had started. He was an expert woodsman, a skilled carpenter, and a man who understood the language of the land. Finn remained his father's shadow, silent and observant. He would gather kindling or carry small buckets of water, his large eyes tracking Abigail's every move. She tried to speak to him, offering him a piece of jerky or a carved wooden horse Thomas had made, but the boy would only accept them after a subtle nod from his father. He never spoke a word. The alliance was uneasy. They worked together, ate their meals separately, she on her porch, they by their shed, and spoke only of the necessary tasks, the weather, the state of the well, the tools they needed. Yet a fragile trust began to grow in the spaces between the words. Jasper was true to his word. He was respectful of her space, never approaching the house without being bid, and his presence, which had at first terrified her, slowly became a source of comfort. The ranch no longer felt empty and haunted by loss. It felt protected. One evening, as Abigail sat on her porch, stitching a baby blanket, she watched as Jasper taught Finn how to set a snare for rabbits. He was patient, his large, scarred hands, guiding his son's small ones with surprising gentleness. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of something other than fear or pragmatism. She had not bought a monster. She had bought a father. And as the sun bled orange and purple across the vast western sky, she wondered what kind of man Jasper Kane truly was, and what kind of trouble had led him to an auction block in the heart of Redemption's Bluff. Word of Abigail Thorne's bizarre purchase spread through Redemption's Bluff like a brush fire. When she rode into town for supplies a week later, the whispers were no longer behind cupped hands. They were a hostile murmur that followed her from the general store to the post office. Women who had once offered condolences for her husband now crossed the street to avoid her. Men tipped their hats with a smirk, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. She was no longer just the poor widow. She was the crazy widow who had brought a killer into her home. Only Mr. Henderson, the elderly proprietor of the general store, treated her with his usual kindness. "Abigail," he said, his voice low as he weighed a bag of beans. "People are talking. They say you're putting yourself and your unborn child in grave danger. Jasper has been nothing but a hard worker and a gentleman, Mr. Henderson. Abigail replied, her chin held high. It's not just that. He leaned closer, his kind eyes clouded with worry. Sheriff Brody has been making inquiries. And Bartholomew Higgins, he's been asking questions too. He's not a man who takes an interest in things without a reason, and his reasons are rarely good. Be careful, my dear. Abigail thanked him for his concern, but his words settled like a stone in her stomach. Why would a man like Higgins care about a vagrant he himself had called trash? The answer arrived 2 days later. It was late afternoon. A storm was brewing in the mountains, the sky turning a bruised purple. Abigail was weeding her small vegetable garden when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She looked up to see 2 riders cresting the hill, Sheriff Brody and Bartholomew Higgins. A knot of ice formed in her belly. Jasper was at the far end of the property, mending the creek fence. He was too far away to hear. Finn, who had been helping her pull weeds, saw the riders and immediately scrambled to his feet, darting behind Abigail to clutch at her skirt, his small body trembling. Higgins dismounted, with the fluid grace of a man who spent his life in the saddle, his expensive boots sinking into the dirt of her humble yard. Brody remained on his horse, a silent, imposing figure. Mrs. Thorne. Higgins began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He removed his hat, revealing a slick of dark combed hair. A pleasure to see you. I was just remarking to the sheriff here how you're managing this place, all on your own. It's a commendable effort, truly. What do you want, Mr. Higgins? Abigail asked, her voice cold. She placed a protective hand over Finn's small head. Higgins's smile didn't reach his eyes. I've come to correct a mistake. Your mistake. At the auction, you acted out of, let's call it, misplaced female compassion. It's understandable. But harboring a man like Cain is foolish. I'm here to relieve you of your burden. He pulled a small leather pouch from his coat. I'll give you $75 for his indenture papers, a tidy profit for you, and I'll take the problem off your hands. I have work on my ranch, more suited to a man of his temperament. Hard work, isolated work. The implication was clear. Work where a man could disappear. He's not for sale, Abigail said flatly. Higgins's smile faltered. Mrs. Thorne, I don't think you understand. That man is dangerous. Sheriff Brody has received a new wire. Cain isn't just a horse thief. He's wanted for questioning in the murder of his prospecting partner up in the mountains. Abigail's blood ran cold, but she thought of Jasper's gentle hands teaching his son of his quiet, steady work. It didn't fit. He said you were a liar, she shot back at Brody. Sheriff Brody shifted in his saddle. A desperate man will say anything. For your own safety, you should sell his papers to Mr. Higgins. The answer is no. Abigail repeated, her voice rising. This is my property. Jasper Cain is under my charge. Now I must ask you to leave. Higgins's polite facade cracked. His eyes hardened into chips of obsidian. You are a foolish, stubborn woman. You are alone out here. A lot can happen. A fire, a stray bullet during a hunt. It would be a tragedy, especially in your condition. The threat hung in the air as thick and heavy as the coming storm. Finn whimpered behind her, and Abigail's fear turned to a white-hot rage. Is that how you get what you want, Mr. Higgins? She spat. By threatening pregnant women. Before Higgins could reply, a new voice cut through the tension, low and dangerous as the rumble of distant thunder. She asks you to leave. Jasper stood 20 yards away, a heavy wood axe resting on his shoulder. He must have seen the riders and circled around through the trees. He moved with a predator's silence, and his appearance was sudden and startling. His face, was a thundercloud, his eyes fixed on Higgins with a look of pure, undiluted hatred. Higgins was momentarily startled, but he recovered quickly, his arrogance reasserting itself. "Well, speak of the devil. We were just discussing your future, Kane." "I have no future that involves you," Jasper growled. He took a step forward, and Higgins instinctively took a step back. Even with his wealth and the law on his side, Higgins was no physical match for the mountain man. "You'd be wise to control your property, Mrs. Thorne." Sheriff Brody warned, his hand drifting casually toward the pistol on his hip. "He is not my property," Abigail said, her voice ringing with conviction as she stepped forward to stand beside Jasper. "He is my employee, and you are trespassing. Leave now." For a long moment, no one moved. It was a standoff. The wealthy baron and the corrupt sheriff against the pregnant widow, and the shackled man turned free. Higgins stared at Jasper, a silent war of wills passing between them. Then with a sneer, Higgins turned and swung himself back onto his horse. "Have it your way," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "But when you're begging for help, don't come crying to me. You made your bed, Mrs. Thorne. You and your pet murderer." He and Sheriff Brody wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in their wake. Abigail finally let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding her knees, feeling weak. Finn ran from behind her and threw his arms around his father's leg, his face buried in the coarse fabric of his trousers. Jasper's eyes were still on the road, his knuckles white where he gripped the axe handle. "Thank you," Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. He turned to look at her, his expression grim. "He won't stop," he said. "This is just the beginning. You should have sold my papers, you and the boy. You would have been safer." "His name is Finn," Abigail said softly, looking at the child. "And no, we would not have been safer. That man is a snake. Whatever he wants from you, it's not worth $75. It's worth much more." Jasper looked down at his son, then back to Abigail, his stormy eyes filled with a conflict she was just beginning to understand. "Higgins didn't just want my indenture," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He wants me dead." The first drops of rain began to fall fat and heavy, splattering in the dust around them. It was the breaking of the drought, but it felt like a chilling omen. The storm had finally arrived, and it was far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The confrontation with Higgins and Brody shattered the fragile peace of the ranch. The unspoken truce between Abigail and Jasper was replaced by a shared sense of siege. They were no longer just a widow and a laborer. They were allies bound together against a common, powerful enemy. The threat lingered in the air, making every snapping twig in the night, every distant coyote howl sound like an approaching menace. Work became their refuge. They threw themselves into it with a desperate energy, racing against the coming winter and the shadow of Higgins. They repaired the house, cleared more land, and with the breaking of the drought, they replanted a late-season crop. In the shared labor, a new intimacy bloomed. Abigail learned the rhythm of his movements, the quiet determination in the set of his jaw. He in turn learned to read the weariness in her posture, often taking the heavier tasks from her, before she could ask his rough hands, surprisingly gentle, as he'd take a bucket from her grasp. One evening, after a long day of rebuilding a collapsed section of the corral, Abigail found Jasper sitting by the shed, sharpening his axe by the light of a lantern. Finn was asleep inside. Abigail brought him a tin cup of coffee. "You should rest," she said softly. He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. A jolt, warm and unexpected, shot up her arm. "Sleep doesn't come easy," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the darkening mountains. "Higgins said you were wanted for murder. she said, deciding to broach the subject that lay between them like a chasm. He said you killed your prospecting partner. Jasper's hand stilled. He stared into the darkness for a long time before speaking. His name was Daniel. Daniel Miller. We were partners for 3 years. More than that. He was like a brother to me. His voice was thick with an emotion she hadn't heard before grief. "We found it," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "After years of searching, we found a vein of gold so rich it would have made us kings. The Devil's Moor, we called it, a small hidden canyon up in the Blackstone Range." He took a sip of coffee, the silence stretching. "We were careful, told no one, but you can't keep a secret that big forever. Higgins has men everywhere, prospectors, trappers on his payroll. Someone must have seen us, followed us. One night, Higgins and 2 of his men showed up at our camp. They weren't there to talk." Abigail listened, her heart aching for him. "Higgins offered to buy our claim. We refused, so he tried to take it. Daniel fought back. One of Higgins's men shot him." Jasper's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, the sound raw with pain. "They would have killed me too, but I managed to get away. Took Finn with me. I was wounded. They hunted us for days. When they couldn't find me, Higgins went to Sheriff Brody and spun a story. Said I'd killed Daniel in a fight over the gold and fled with it. It was my word, a mountain man's against his." "The gold," Abigail whispered. "Is it still there?" "All of it," Jasper confirmed. "But it's not the gold he wants now. Not just the gold. He wants me silenced permanently. I'm the only one who saw him murder Daniel." It all made sense now, the auction. Higgins's bizarre interest, his desperation to get his hands on Jasper. It was never about labor. It was about burying the only witness to his crime. "There must be proof," Abigail insisted. Jasper fell silent. He carefully set his cup down and rolled up the sleeve of his worn shirt. By the flickering lantern light, she saw a network of scars on his forearm. But one mark was different. It wasn't a scar. It was a tattoo crudely inked into his skin. It looked like a map, a series of lines and symbols. "Before he died," Jasper said, his voice heavy, "Daniel made me promise. He knew they'd come for me. He had this map of the claim, the real one, on a piece of parchment. He made me burn it. But first he made me copy a section of it here." He tapped a specific symbol on his arm. "It's the entrance to the mine, hidden behind a waterfall. The paper map could be stolen. This I would carry to the grave." Abigail reached out her fingers, gently tracing the lines on his skin. It was warm, alive. This wasn't just a map. It was a testament, a story of friendship and betrayal written on flesh. In that moment, the last of her fear of him vanished, completely replaced by a fierce, protective anger on his behalf. "We have to get that proof," she said, her voice filled with a new resolve. "We have to show everyone what kind of man Bartholomew Higgins really is." "It's too dangerous," Jasper said, pulling his sleeve down. "He watches this place. We'd never make it to the mountains. He'd hunt us down." "Then we have to be smarter than him," she countered. Their conversation was interrupted by a small cry from the shed. Finn was having a nightmare. Jasper was on his feet, in an instant disappearing inside. Abigail could hear his low, soothing murmurs, the sounds of a father comforting his child. She waited. When he emerged a few minutes later, his face was etched with worry. "He has them often," he said quietly. "Ever since he saw Daniel fall, the weight of what he was carrying for his son was immense. He was not just fighting for his own life and freedom, but for the soul of his child." "He needs a home, Jasper," Abigail said softly. "A real home, not a life on the run." He looked at her, then at the house, its windows glowing warmly in the twilight. He looked at her swollen belly, a symbol of a future he probably thought he'd never have. In his eyes, she saw the walls he had built around his heart begin to crumble. "Abigail." He said her name, sounding strange and wonderful on his lips for the first time. "Why did you do it that day at the auction? Why did you buy me?" She thought for a moment the real answer, surprising even herself. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "I saw a father protecting his son, and I was scared. I felt alone, and I suppose I thought that if I could save someone else, I might just be able to save myself too." He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the heat radiating from him. He slowly raised a hand, his calloused thumb gently brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark of life and warmth in the encroaching darkness. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. They were no longer just allies in a siege. They were two broken souls finding shelter in one another. And in that shared moment, a dangerous, beautiful hope began to take root. The first snows of the season dusted the peaks of the Blackstone Range, a stark white warning that time was running out. The fragile hope that had sparked between Abigail and Jasper was now tempered by a constant gnawing anxiety. Higgins had been quiet for weeks, a silence that was more unnerving than his open threats. It was the coiled silence of a snake before it strikes. The strike came on a moonless night. A storm had rolled in a furious squall of wind and freezing rain that rattled the windows of the small house and turned the ranch into a sea of mud. Abigail had insisted that Jasper and Finn move into the spare room in the house. The shed was no place to weather a winter storm. It was a decision that likely saved their lives. Abigail was awoken by a frantic barking from their new cattle dog a stray Jasper had coaxed back to health. The sound was sharp, filled with alarm. She sat up in bed, her heart instantly pounding. In the next room she heard the soft creak of floorboards. Jasper was already awake. A sudden splintering crash from the front of the house made her cry out. It was the sound of the front door being kicked in. "Abigail, Finn. The back room, now." Jasper's voice was a low, urgent command from the hallway. She scrambled out of bed, her pregnant belly making her clumsy. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace as Finn, his face pale with terror, ran into her room. She pulled him close, her body shielding his, as she backed toward the small bedroom at the rear of the house. Jasper appeared in the doorway, a hunting rifle Thomas's old Winchester held expertly in his hands. In the dim light from the hallway, she could see the grim set of his jaw. The mountain man had been replaced by a warrior. "How many?" she whispered. "4, he breathed. "Stay here. Barricade the door." He melted back into the shadows of the main room. Abigail shoved a heavy oak dresser in front of the bedroom door, her hands shaking, but her mind strangely clear. She pushed Finn under the bed. "Stay there and do not make a sound, no matter what you hear," she commanded, her voice a fierce whisper. The sounds from the other room were terrifying. Heavy footsteps, the smash of glass, and the low, guttural voices of men who were not there to talk. "Find him," a voice snarled. "Higgins wants him alive if possible. The woman and the boy don't matter." A cold fury washed over Abigail, eclipsing her fear. She gripped the poker, her knuckles white. They would not touch this family she was building. They would not destroy this fragile life. A gunshot exploded deafeningly loud in the small house. It was followed by a man's scream of pain, then another shot from a different gun. Abigail pressed her ear to the door, her breath held tight. She could hear a struggle, grunts, the thud of bodies hitting the floor, the splintering of furniture. Then a new sound. The acrid smell of smoke began to seep under the door. "He's barricaded! Burn him out!" the voice from outside yelled. Panic seized her. They were trying to burn down the house with them inside. She looked around the small room, her eyes falling on the single window. It was their only way out. She pulled Finn from under the bed. "We have to go," she said, her voice strained. She struggled with the old warped window frame, her fingers raw. Finally, it gave way with a groan. The freezing rain hit her face, a welcome shock. The ground was a 10-foot drop into thick, muddy bushes. It was a dangerous jump, especially for her. Just as she was about to help Finn out, the bedroom door shuddered under a heavy blow. An axe blade splintered through the wood near the top. They were breaking through. "Jasper!" she screamed, her voice filled with desperation. Another gunshot echoed from the main room, followed by a heavy thud against their door. And then silence. Had he been hit? Was he dead? The axe blade struck again, widening the hole. Abigail made a decision. She pushed Finn toward the window. "Go run to the creek and hide in the hollow log. Don't stop for anything." Tears streamed down Finn's face, but he obeyed his small body, scrambling out the window and disappearing into the stormy darkness. The door crashed open. A large bearded man stood there, his face illuminated by the growing fire in the next room. He grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Nowhere left to run, little mother." He lunged for her. Abigail swung the iron poker with all her might, connecting with his shoulder. He roared in pain and anger, but it only slowed him for a second. He grabbed the poker, twisting it from her grasp. He backed her against the wall, his foul breath hot on her face. Suddenly the man's eyes went wide. He made a gurgling sound, and a dark stain spread across the front of his shirt. He collapsed at her feet, revealing Jasper standing in the doorway behind him, a hunting knife in his hand, and a bloody gash on his forehead. "Are you hurt?" he gasped, his chest heaving. "No." She breathed, her legs threatening to buckle. "Finn! I sent him to the creek." "Good," Jasper said, grabbing her arm. "We have to move. The others will be back." He led her through the house. 2 of Higgins's men lay dead in the main room, which was now filled with smoke and flames. They staggered out the back door and into the storm, the fire consuming their home behind them. They found Finn huddled in the hollow log, shivering but unharmed. Jasper wrapped the boy in his own coat. They stood for a moment in the driving rain, watching the flames leap into the night sky, devouring everything they had built. The house, the barn, their sanctuary, it was all turning to ash. Despair washed over Abigail. They had nothing left. They had lost. "No," Jasper said, as if reading her thoughts. His voice was raw but full of iron. "We haven't lost. He overplayed his hand. He tried to murder us. Now we're done hiding." He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a fearsome intensity in the firelight. "He thinks he's driven us out. He thinks we'll run and hide in the mountains like scared animals. But we're not going to hide. Oh, Shvatu." "What are we going to do?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling from cold and shock. "We are going to the Devil's Moor," he declared. "We're going to get the proof. And then—" his gaze turned toward the distant faint lights of Redemption's Bluff. "We're going to hunt the hunter." The fire crackled a funeral pyre for their old life. But in the ashes, something new was being forged, a shared, unbending resolve to see justice done, no matter the cost. The journey into the Blackstone Range was a crucible. The fire had taken everything but the clothes on their backs, Thomas's rifle, Jasper's knife, and the fierce resolve that burned in their hearts. They moved under the cover of the storm, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the smouldering ruins of the ranch before Higgins's men could regroup and track them. Jasper was transformed. The quiet, steady farmer was gone, replaced by the mountain man he had once been. He moved through the wilderness with an innate, almost supernatural skill. He found shelter in rocky overhangs, foraged for edible roots the fire hadn't touched, and led them along game trails that were invisible to an untrained eye. He was their guide and their guardian, his senses constantly on alert. For Abigail it was a brutal test of endurance. The cold seeped into her bones, her body ached, and the child in her womb felt impossibly heavy. But she refused to complain. She drew strength from Jasper's resilience, and from the quiet courage of Finn, who trudged along without a word of protest, his small hand often finding hers for reassurance. The further they went from civilization, the more they became a self-reliant unit, a wild, determined family forged in crisis. The nights were the hardest and the most intimate. They huddled together for warmth, under a makeshift lean-to of pine boughs, the fire a small, defiant circle of light against the immense, dark wilderness. It was during these quiet moments that the last barriers between them dissolved. Jasper would tend to her swollen ankles, his touch gentle and sure. She would clean the gash on his forehead, her fingers lingering on his skin. They spoke in low tones, sharing stories of their pasts of Thomas and his dreams of Daniel and his infectious laugh. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were partners, their lives and futures inextricably intertwined. After 3 grueling days, they arrived at a narrow, mist-shrouded canyon. The walls were sheer black rock, and the roar of rushing water echoed from its depths. "Devil's Maw," Jasper said, his voice hushed with reverence and sorrow. He led them along a treacherous hidden ledge until they stood before a cascading waterfall that plunged into a deep turquoise pool. The spray was ice-cold on their faces. "Behind there," Jasper pointed his voice, barely audible over the roar. "The entrance is behind the water." Holding Finn tightly, he pushed through the icy curtain of the waterfall. Abigail followed, gasping as the frigid water soaked her. On the other side, hidden in the rock, was a low, dark opening, the entrance to the mine. Inside, the air was still and cold, smelling of damp earth and stone. Jasper lit a torch he'd fashioned from a pine branch and pitch. The flickering light revealed a narrow tunnel that opened into a larger cavern, and there, glittering in the torchlight, was the source of all their trouble. A thick, brilliant vein of gold ran through the quartz wall like a river of frozen fire. It was more wealth than Abigail could have ever imagined. But they weren't there for the gold. Daniel was meticulous, Jasper said, his voice echoing in the cavern. He kept a journal. He documented everything, our findings, our plans, everything. He led them to a small, dry alcove at the back of the cavern where they had made their camp. A dusty bedroll and some prospecting tools lay where they had been left. Tucked inside an old ammunition box was a leather-bound journal. Jasper opened it with trembling hands. Daniel's neat cursive script filled the pages. They read through it, their hope growing with every page. It was all there, the date they found the claim, the initial friendly visit from Higgins, his subsequent threats, and detailed descriptions of the men who accompanied him. It was a damning account of Higgins's greed and intimidation, but it was the final entry that made Abigail's blood turn to ice. It was dated the day of his murder. October 14th, it read, "Higgins returned tonight. He knows we will not sell. I fear the worst. If something happens to me, this journal must get to the authorities. Jasper does not know the full truth of our find. The claim was registered not just in our names, but under my family name, Miller. It is my legacy, and I pray it finds its way back to my only living kin, My sister Abigail Thorne of Redemption's Bluff. I ran away from home years ago after a fight with our father and was too proud and ashamed to ever return. I heard of her marriage to Thomas Thorne from a passing traveller. I pray she is happy. This wealth is for her." Abigail stared at the page, the words blurring through her tears. Daniel Miller, her long-lost brother. The wild, adventurous boy who had vanished a decade ago, breaking their parents' hearts. He had been here. He had been alive, and he had been thinking of her. The gold, the ranch, the danger, it was all tied together in a knot of family loss and a legacy she never knew she had. She looked up at Jasper, her eyes wide with a torrent of emotions. "He was my brother." She choked out the words, feeling unreal. "Daniel was my brother." Jasper looked at her, his own face, a mask of shock and dawning understanding. He had been protecting not just his partner's legacy, but the birthright of the very woman who had saved him. Her impulsive act of compassion at the auction had not been random. It was fate, a sister unknowingly saving the man who held the key to her brother's memory and his justice. He reached out, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Abigail sobbed against his chest, tears of grief for the brother she never got to know again, and tears of gratitude for the man holding her. In the heart of the mountain, surrounded by a fortune in gold, they had found a truth far more precious. "He brought us together. Abigail," Jasper whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "And I swear on his memory I will not let him down. We will take this journal back. We will make Higgins pay for what he did. For Daniel. And for us." They now had more than just proof. They had a cause, a righteous fury, and a bond that had been sealed by fate itself. They were no longer running from a tyrant. They were returning to claim a legacy and deliver a brother's final damning justice. Their return to Redemption's Bluff was not for hiding, but for a reckoning. They chose the Sunday church service as their stage, the one place where Bartholomew Higgins's power was subject to a higher authority. Slipping into the back of the church, they waited for the perfect moment. As the pastor spoke of false witness, Abigail and Jasper strode down the central aisle, bringing the service to a stunned halt. "You preach of liars." Abigail's voice rang out clear and strong, "while a murderer sits in your front pew." She stood before Higgins, holding up the leather journal. "This belonged to my brother Daniel Miller. He wrote how you, Mr. Higgins, murdered him for his gold claim." She read the final damning entry, the words, silencing the church. Higgins called it a forgery, but his bluster failed when Jasper produced the bullet pulled from Daniel's body, identifying it as one fired from Higgins's distinctive ivory-handled pistol. Cornered and exposed, Higgins snapped. He grabbed Finn, holding the boy as a human shield and pressing the gun to his head. As the congregation screamed, Jasper moved with quiet swiftness. He hurled a heavy brass collection plate, which spun through the air and shattered Higgins's wrist. The gun fell. As Finn scrambled to safety, the enraged townsfolk men Higgins had bullied for years subdued him. Sheriff Brody, his complicity clear, was also seized. Months later, on the porch of their rebuilt ranch, Abigail held her newborn daughter, Hope. Jasper stood beside her, his arm around her, with Finn playing freely in the yard. They were a family, forged in fire, their future built not on gold, but on a justice-hard one, and a love that had redeemed them all. And so, a story that began with a desperate act of charity at a dusty town auction ends not with ruin but with revelation and rebirth. A pregnant widow, a condemned mountain man, and a silent boy proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. They showed an entire town that the deepest truths are often hidden beneath the roughest exteriors, and that justice, no matter how long it's buried, will always find its way to the light. Their family was a testament to the fact that home isn't just a place you build with wood and nails, but something you forge in the fires of loyalty and love. If this story of unlikely heroes and hard-won justice resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a tale of the untamed West, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, survival, and redemption. Thank you for listening.